17 years after her husband and 8-year-old daughter vanished without a trace following a church revival. Reverend Martha Washington still lights a candle for them every October 15th, refusing to let their memory fade into the silence that has haunted her congregation. Tonight, as golden light from dozens of votive candles flickered across the wooden pews of Bethel Aim Church, Martha moved through the sanctuary with practiced reverence, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. The scent of melting wax mingled with the lingering aroma of Sunday's communion bread, creating an atmosphere both sacred and sorrowful. Martha paused before the altar, adjusting the framed photograph of David and Keisha that she placed there each year. David's warm smile seemed to follow her as she worked, his arm wrapped protectively around their daughter, who beamed at the camera with gap-toothed joy, her Sunday dress a vibrant purple that had been her favorite color. "You're gonna wear yourself, thin baby girl," came a familiar voice from the church entrance. Martha's mother, Eunice, shuffled down the center aisle, her silver hair perfectly styled despite her 74 years and the aluminum walker she now relied upon. 17 years of this vigil, and you still set up like you're expecting the whole city to show? Martha straightened, smoothing her black dress with hands that bore the calluses of both prayer and practical work. "Mama, you know hope doesn't have an expiration date. Besides, Mrs. Johnson from 3rd Street said she'd try to make it, and you know how Brother Thompson feels about missing any church gathering." Eunice settled into the front pew with a soft grunt, her eyes moving over the carefully arranged memorial. That man would attend the opening of an envelope if it was held in a sanctuary. She paused, her voice gentling. "But honey, what if tonight's different? What if this year someone walks through those doors with answers instead of just condolences?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with possibility and pain. Martha had asked herself the same thing countless times, but tonight felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the unusual warmth of the October evening, or the way the candlelight seemed brighter than usual, but something in her spirit whispered that change was coming as the first congregants began arriving, their voices creating a gentle murmur of comfort and community. Martha found herself glancing toward the doors more frequently than usual, as if expecting someone unexpected to appear. The memorial service had ended just after 9, with the usual embrace of familiar arms and whispered promises to keep David and Keisha in prayer. Martha now sat in her modest living room, helping Eunice sort through the sympathy cards that still arrived each October, a testament to how deeply the community had been touched by the disappearance. The television murmured softly in the background, casting shifting blue light across the floral wallpaper that David had promised to replace someday. "Sister Patterson wrote again," Eunice said, holding up a card decorated with praying hands. "Says she still dreams about Keisha sometimes, sees her all grown up and beautiful." Martha nodded absently, her mind still lingering in the sanctuary where she'd felt that strange sense of anticipation. Perhaps it was simply the emotional weight of another anniversary, or maybe the way Brother Thompson had gripped her hands. A little tighter tonight, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he promised to keep believing. The phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet intimacy of their evening ritual. Martha glanced at the clock on the mantel. 9:47 p.m. Late calls usually meant hospital visits or church emergencies, the kind that required a pastor's immediate attention. "Reverend Washington, this is Deputy Williams with the Crawford County Sheriff's Office." The voice was professional but carried an undercurrent of something that made Martha's breath catch. "Ma'am, I apologize for calling so late, but I have some information that couldn't wait until morning." Martha's free hand found the arm of her chair, gripping the worn fabric. 17 years had taught her to brace for disappointment, but something in the deputy's tone made her pulse quicken. "What kind of information?" "We've found a vehicle, ma'am. A 1987 Dodge van, blue with wood paneling. License plate reads ... She heard papers rustling. Delta-Victor-2-7-9-1. "Does that match the description of your husband's vehicle?" The room seemed to tilt. Martha's vision blurred as memories crashed over her David loading overnight, bag into that van, promising they'd be back by Sunday dinner. The way the afternoon sun had gleamed off the freshly waxed hood as they drove away. "Ma'am, are you there?" "Yes," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. Eunice had stopped sorting cards, and was watching her daughter's face with growing alarm. "Yes, that's David's van." "Where did you find it?" "Behind an old chapel. Near Millerville. Place is scheduled for demolition tomorrow, but the crew found it first." The drive to Crawford County stretched through rolling hills, dotted with pine trees and forgotten farmhouses, their paint peeling like old scabs in the morning sun. Martha gripped the passenger seat of Deputy Williams' cruiser while Eunice sat, silent in the back, her walker folded beside her. The deputy, a soft-spoken man in his 30s with kind eyes, had offered to drive them rather than having them follow in Martha's car, a kindness that made the journey feel both more official and more ominous. "It's just up ahead," Deputy Williams said, slowing as they approached a cluster of buildings that looked like relics from another era. A hand-painted sign reading Cornerstone Chapel hung crooked on a rusted post, half obscured by kudzu vines that had claimed most of the surrounding fence. The chapel itself was a modest white building with peeling paint and boarded windows, its steeple listing slightly to one side, as if the weight of abandoned prayers had finally become too much. Behind it, barely visible through a tangle of blackberry bushes and scrub oak, Martha could see the dull glint of metal. A man in work clothes emerged from behind the building as they parked, removing his baseball cap to reveal thinning brown hair and a face weathered by outdoor work. He approached with the careful gait of someone accustomed to navigating uneven ground. "This here's Jake Morrison," Deputy Williams said as they climbed out. "He's the foreman for the demolition crew. Jake, this is Reverend Washington and her mother, Mrs. Barrett." Jake's handshake was firm but gentle, his eyes reflecting genuine sympathy. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry about what y'all have been through. When we found that van yesterday, I knew it had to mean something to somebody. Been sitting back there so long, the vines almost swallowed it whole." Martha followed him around the chapel, her heart hammering against her ribs. The van emerged from the vegetation like something surfacing from deep water blue paint faded to gray in places, wood paneling warped and splitting, but unmistakably David's pride and joy. The license plate, partially obscured by mud and rust, still read DV2791. "Dear Jesus," Eunice whispered, her voice catching. Martha approached slowly, her hand trembling as she reached toward the driver's side door. Through the grimy window, she could see the steering wheel cover she'd bought David for his birthday, still wrapped around the wheel like a promise kept across 17 years of silence. "Ma'am," Jake said quietly, "before you look inside, you should know we haven't touched anything." Figured the police would want to handle it proper. The Millerville Diner occupied a converted gas station on the county's main road, its neon sign flickering between open and ope in a rhythm that matched Martha's unsteady heartbeat. Jake had suggested they grab coffee, while Deputy Williams coordinated with the state crime scene investigators, and Martha found herself grateful for the normalcy of vinyl booths and the smell of brewing coffee after the surreal discovery at the chapel. "Been working demolition in this county for near on 15 years, Jake said, stirring sugar into his coffee with calloused fingers. "Never seen anything like finding that van, though. Made my whole crew go quiet, you know, something about it. Just felt ... heavy." Eunice wrapped her hands around her coffee mug as if seeking warmth despite the October heat. "That chapel, how long has it been empty?" "Oh, going on 12 years now, I'd say. Maybe 13? Jake's eyes grew distant. "Used to be quite the place back in the day. Pastor Crane ran a tight ship, had folks driving from 3 counties over for his revival meetings. My own daddy went a few times, said the man could preach fire and brimstone like nobody's business." Martha leaned forward, her coffee untouched. "And cooling, Pastor Cranus, he's still around? Last I heard, he was in a nursing home over in Tuscaloosa. Alzheimer's got him pretty bad, from what folks say." Jake paused, studying Martha's face with genuine concern. "You thinking your husband might have attended services there?" "David visited a lot of different churches," Martha said carefully. "He was ... searching, I suppose. Always looking for a deeper connection to his faith. It's possible he heard about the revivals." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "That would have been right around 91-92 when Pastor Crane was at his peak. Cornerstone, it was packed every Sunday, and the Wednesday night meetings drew even bigger crowds. Folks came from Birmingham, Montgomery, even as far as Atlanta sometimes. Wednesday nights, Martha's pulse quickened. David and Keisha had disappeared on a Saturday, but David often attended midweek services when his work schedule allowed. "Oh, yes, ma'am." Pastor Crane called them his deeper calling meetings, said Sunday service was for the whole family, but Wednesday nights were for the truly devoted. Jake's expression grew troubled, though toward the end, before the church closed, some folks started talking, said the Wednesday meetings had gotten ... different somehow. Martha felt Eunice's hand find hers under the table, a warm anchor in the growing uncertainty. Different how? Jake glanced around the nearly empty diner, then leaned closer. "Ma'am, I'd be happy to help you look into this more. I know this county like the back of my hand, and I've got connections with folks who might remember your husband. If he was here, the Crawford County Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of decades in neglect. Inside, the musty scent of old paper and preservation chemicals created an atmosphere that felt like stepping into someone else's memories. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, was a small woman with silver-streaked hair who moved through the cluttered archives with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. "Church records from the 90s, she murmured, pulling a cardboard box from a high shelf with Jake's assistance. Most of the local congregations donated their materials when they closed or consolidated. Cornerstone Chapel's records came to us in 2003, I believe." Martha watched Jake handle the box with surprising familiarity, as if he'd done this before. When Mrs. Chen stepped away to retrieve additional materials, Martha noticed how quickly he located the visitor sign-in books, his fingers moving through the chronologically arranged documents without hesitation. "Here we go," Jake said, opening a worn ledger to October 1991. Pastor Crane was meticulous about keeping track of visitors. Said it helped him know who might be interested in joining the congregation permanently. Eunice peered over Martha's shoulder as they scanned the handwritten entries. The pages were filled with names, addresses, and brief notes in Pastor Crane's careful script. Martha's breath caught as her eyes landed on a familiar signature halfway down the page dated October 12, 1991. David Washington, Birmingham, seeking deeper spiritual connection. Daughter Keisha, 8, accompanied the words blurred. As tears gathered in Martha's eyes, it was proof that David had brought Keisha to Cornerstone Chapel just 3 days before they vanished. But the entry raised more questions than it answered. Why hadn't David mentioned the visit? Why had he taken Keisha to a Wednesday evening service? "There's more," Jake said quietly, turning the page. Martha noticed his finger trace along the entries with practiced ease, as if he'd read these records before. "Look at this note from October 15th. Pastor Crane's handwriting was more hurried here, almost urgent. D. Washington expressed concerns about Wednesday meetings, spoke privately after service, recommended he attend Brotherhood gathering for clarification. Scheduled for Saturday evening." Martha's hands trembled as she read the final entry dated October 16th. The day after David and Keisha had disappeared, D.Y. Washington and daughter failed to attend Brotherhood meeting. "Follow-up required." "The Brotherhood meeting," Martha whispered. "What was that?" Jake's expression grew troubled as he studied the page, but something in his eyes suggested he knew more than he was saying. That evening, in their modest motel room, Martha sat on the edge of the bed, staring at photocopies of the church records, while Eunice sorted through their overnight bags. The fluorescent light cast harsh shadows that seemed to age everything it touched, making the faded floral bedspread look like something from another era entirely. "I should have paid more attention," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. Above the hum of the air conditioning unit, David was always visiting different churches, but I thought it was just his way of exploring his faith. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. David at their kitchen table on a Sunday morning in September 1991, scanning the religion section of the Birmingham News with his reading glasses perched on his nose. Keisha had been coloring at the same table, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked on a picture of angels. "There's a revival meeting down in Crawford County," he'd said, circling something with his pen. "Pastor there supposedly has a real gift for healing. Might be worth checking out." Martha had been rushing to get ready for their own Sunday service at Bethel Aim, barely listening as she searched for Keisha's Sunday shoes. "Ma'am," she'd murmured, distracted by the familiar chaos of Sunday morning preparations. "I'm serious." "Martha," David had continued, his voice taking on that earnest quality it got when something truly captured his attention. This Pastor Crane has testimonials from people who say he helped them find their true calling, not just regular church, stuff something deeper. Now, 17 years later, Martha realized she should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why David felt their own faith community wasn't enough, why he was always seeking something more. At the time, she'd been proud of his spiritual curiosity, but now it felt like a warning sign she'd missed entirely. David always thought there was more to faith than Sunday service and potluck dinners, she told Eunice, who had stopped unpacking to listen. He used to say that most churches only scratched the surface, that real spiritual transformation required. Going deeper, Eunice settled into the chair by the window, her expression thoughtful. Some men search for God in places they shouldn't, baby girl. Sometimes that searching leads them into darkness instead of light. Martha nodded, understanding for the first time that David's spiritual hunger might have made him vulnerable to something predatory masquerading as salvation. The question that haunted her now was whether he'd recognize the danger before it was too late. Sunset Manor nursing home smelled of disinfectant and resignation, its beige hallways lined with wheelchairs, and the soft murmur of afternoon television programs. Martha followed a cheerful aide past rooms where elderly residents stared out windows at a world that seemed to have forgotten them, their faces bearing the distant expression of people living more in memory than in the present moment. Pastor Elijah Crane sat in the sunroom, a frail man in his 80s whose once powerful frame had been whittled down by time and disease. His white hair was carefully combed, and he wore a cardigan despite the October warmth, his hands folded in his lap with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. Pastor Crane? Martha approached slowly, pulling up a chair beside him. My name is Martha Washington. I'm a reverend from Birmingham, and I was hoping you might remember my husband, David. The old man's eyes, cloudy with cataracts, focused on her with effort. For a moment, there was no recognition, just the vacant stare that Martha had seen too often in her pastoral visits to similar facilities. David Washington, she repeated gently. He visited your church in October 1991. He brought his daughter, Keisha. She was 8 years old. Something flickered in Pastor Crane's expression, like a candle flame guttering in the wind. Washington, he murmured, his voice dry as autumn leaves. The searcher. Yes, I remember the searcher. Eunice leaned forward from her chair. What do you remember about him, Pastor? He had questions, Crane said, his gaze drifting toward the window. So many questions about the deeper things, the hidden things. He wanted to know about the brotherhood. His voice dropped to a whisper, and his hands began to shake slightly. I should have sent him away. Should have told him some doors ought to stay closed. Martha's pulse quickened. The brotherhood, what was that? Pastor? Men who wanted more. Then Sunday preaching, Crane continued, his words coming in disconnected fragments. They met after the regular folks went home. Special meetings. Private meetings. He looked directly at Martha suddenly, his eyes clearing with frightening intensity. I tried to warn him, you know. Told him some hungers lead to dangerous places. What kind of dangerous places? Martha pressed, though part of her dreaded the answer. Pastor Crane's expression shifted, becoming agitated. The little girl had such bright eyes. Reminded me of my granddaughter, I told them. I said no children at the Brotherhood meetings, but they said she was already there, already seen too much. His voice broke. God forgive me, I should have stopped them. The aide appeared at Martha's shoulder. He gets upset when he talks too much about the old days. Maybe it's time to let him rest. Asterisk, but Martha couldn't let go. Pastor, what happened? To David and Keisha, Jake's property sat at the end of a gravel road lined with towering pines, the kind of isolated location that made Martha wish she'd insisted on meeting somewhere more public. His modest house was surrounded by the organized chaos of a man who made his living with his hand stacks of lumber, rusted equipment, and a workshop that glowed with warm yellow light in the gathering dusk. I appreciate you ladies coming out. Here, Jake said, leading them onto his front porch where 3 rocking chairs waited. What I need to tell you, well, it's not the kind of conversation for a public place. Martha settled into the offered chair, noting how Jake's hands trembled slightly as he poured sweet tea from a pitcher. The confidence he'd shown at the historical society seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a nervousness that made the evening air feel heavier. I wasn't entirely honest with you earlier, Jake began, his eyes fixed on the weathered porch boards. "About my connection to Cornerstone Chapel. I didn't just know about the church from hearing folks talk. I was a member there for about 3 years, from 89 to 92. Eunice's rocking chair creaked to a stop. You were there when David visited. That's just Etsy left the congregation in early 91, before your husband ever showed up. But I still had friends there, people who talked." Jake's voice grew quieter. "The thing is, Mrs. Washington, I knew about the Brotherhood meetings. I knew what Pastor Crane was trying to get your husband involved in." Martha felt her stomach drop. "What kind of meetings were they, Jake?" "Started innocent enough," Jake said, staring into the darkness beyond his porch light. "Men getting together after regular service, talking about taking faith to the next level. Pastor Crane said we were chosen for something special, something the regular congregation couldn't understand." He paused, rubbing his weathered hands together. "But it got strange real quick. They started talking about purification rituals, about how families were holding back true believers from reaching their spiritual potential." "Families." Martha's voice came out as a whisper. Jake nodded grimly. "They said wives and children were distractions from God's true calling, that a man couldn't achieve real spiritual enlightenment while he was still tied to worldly responsibilities." His eyes met Martha's for the first time since they'd arrived. "I left when they started talking about permanent separation from family ties." "But you said you weren't there when David visited," Eunice pointed out, her voice sharp with suspicion. Jake's hesitation was almost imperceptible, but Martha caught it. "That's right, but like I said, I still had friends who told me what happened that Saturday night. How your husband brought his little girl to what was supposed to be a men-only meeting. The fluorescent lights in the Crawford County Sheriff's station cast harsh shadows across Detective Rodriguez's weathered face as he studied the inconsistencies in Jake's statement." Martha sat rigid in her chair, watching Jake's composure crumble under the methodical questioning that had been going on for 2 hours. "Let's go through this one more time, Mr. Morrison," Detective Rodriguez said, his voice patient but relentless. "You claim you left Cornerstone Chapel in early 1991, but we found your signature in the visitor log, dated October 15, 1991, the same night. David Washington attended that Brotherhood meeting." Jake's hands clenched and unclenched on the metal table. I went back that one time. I was worried about some of the guys I'd left behind. Worried enough to attend a meeting you've described as dangerous." Martha interjected her pastoral training in reading people, telling her that Jake was still holding back crucial information. "Ma'am, I swear I was trying to help." Jake's eyes darted between Martha and the detective. "When I heard through mutual friends that a man from Birmingham was asking questions about the Brotherhood, I knew he was walking into something he didn't understand." Detective Rodriguez leaned forward. "So you were present when David Washington brought his daughter to that meeting. What happened, Jake?" The silence stretched until Martha could hear the wall clock ticking like a heartbeat. Finally, Jake's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Your husband, he figured out real quick what kind of operation Pastor Crane was running. The Brotherhood wasn't about spiritual growth, it was about control, about separating men from their families so they'd be completely dependent on the group. And Keisha," Martha's voice barely held steady. "She wasn't supposed to be there," Jake said, his voice breaking. "David had brought her because he couldn't find a babysitter, figured she'd wait in the van. But when the meeting ran long, she came looking for her daddy." Jake covered his face with his hands. Pastor Crane and the other leaders, they saw her as a problem, a witness to things she shouldn't have seen. Detective Rodriguez's pen had stopped moving. "What things, Jake?" "They were pressuring new members to sign over property to cut ties with family completely. When David realized what they wanted, he threatened to report them to authorities, said he was taking his daughter and leaving." Jake looked directly at Martha, tears in his eyes. "That's when Brother Samuel, the man who really ran things behind Pastor Crane, said they couldn't let that happen." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. "Brother Samuel Hayes. He's the one who decided your husband and daughter knew too much to walk away." The autumn morning mist clung to the woods behind Cornerstone Chapel like grief made visible. Martha walked beside Detective Rodriguez, her mother's hand clasped tightly in hers, while Jake led them forward in handcuffs, his Orange County jumpsuit a stark contrast against the browns and golds of the October landscape. About 50 yards more, Jake said, his voice hollow with resignation. "Past that lightning-struck oak there." The search dogs had already confirmed what Martha's heart had known since yesterday. The scent trail led away from the chapel and into these woods where 17 years of leaves had carpeted the forest floor in layers of decay and forgetting. Each step felt like walking toward the end of hope, but also toward the beginning of truth. Here, Jake stopped beside a depression in the earth that was barely visible beneath years of accumulated debris. "Brother Samuel made us dig deep, said the Lord would forgive us if we were protecting the brotherhood from persecution." Martha's legs nearly gave out as she stared at the innocuous patch of ground that had hidden her family for 17 years. Detective Rodriguez steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow while the forensics team began their careful work with brushes and small tools, treating the site with the reverence of archaeologists, uncovering something sacred. "Tell me what happened that night," Detective Rodriguez said quietly to Jake, his voice just loud enough for Martha to hear. Jake's face contorted with a pain that seemed genuine. "Your husband tried to leave with Keisha when he realized what the Brotherhood really was. But Brother Samuel said they couldn't let him expose the operation. Too many men had already signed over everything, cut ties with their families. David fought them when they tried to separate him from his daughter." Martha closed her eyes, seeing David's face in her mind, the same determined expression he'd worn when defending his patients or protecting his family. He died trying to save her. "Yes, ma'am." And when it was over, Brother Samuel, said Keisha, had seen too much, that she'd never stop asking questions about where her daddy went. Jake's voice broke completely. "I swear to you, Mrs. Washington, I tried to talk them out of it. But I was outnumbered, and I was scared. The forensics photographers." Flash began popping methodically, documenting what the earth was finally ready to surrender. Martha found herself praying not just for David and Keisha's souls, but for the strength to witness what 17 years of silence had hidden. The Jefferson County Courthouse buzzed with the energy of a case that had captured statewide attention, exposure of a religious cult that had operated in rural Alabama for over a decade. Martha sat in the front row of the gallery, Eunice beside her, watching Jake Morrison take the witness stand for his third day of testimony. His plea agreement had reduced his charges in exchange for cooperation, but the weight of 17 years seemed to have aged him beyond his years. "Mr. Morrison," the prosecutor said, approaching the witness stand with deliberate steps, "please tell the court about the night of October 15th, 1991, when David Washington brought his daughter to what he believed was a prayer meeting." Jake's voice was steady now, strengthened by weeks of telling this story to investigators. Brother Samuel Hayes had been building what he called a purified congregation, men who would surrender everything to the Brotherhood, their property, their bank accounts, their family ties. He told us it was God's plan for achieving true spiritual enlightenment. Martha watched the defendant's table where 3 elderly men sat in orange jumpsuits, their faces showing no remorse. Samuel Hayes, the apparent leader, kept his eyes fixed on Jake with the intensity of someone who still believed he held power over his former follower. David Washington arrived that Saturday evening expecting a spiritual discussion. Jake continued. Instead, he walked into a recruitment meeting. Brother Samuel presented him with papers to sign documents that would transfer custody of his daughter to the Brotherhood and deed his Birmingham property to the church. "How did Mr. Washington respond?" the prosecutor asked. He laughed at first, thought it was some kind of joke. Then, when he realized they were serious, he got angry, said no one was taking his daughter anywhere, and he was going to report the whole operation. Jake's voice grew quieter. That's when Brother Samuel gave the signal. Martha forced herself to listen as Jake described the violence that followed how David had fought to protect Keisha, how the 8-year-old girl had screamed for her father, as the Brotherhood members overpowered him. The clinical details felt like knives, each word cutting deeper into wounds that had never properly healed. Brother Samuel said they had no choice, Jake testified, his eyes finding Martha's across the courtroom. He claimed God was testing their commitment to the Brotherhood, that sometimes righteous work required terrible sacrifices. In the gallery, Martha felt her faith battered but not broken, transformed the horror into something approaching understanding. Evil often disguised itself as righteousness. And David had died trying to protect their daughter from predators who cloaked their crimes in Scripture. The October morning air carried the same crisp promise it had 17 years ago. But this time Martha felt peace rather than dread as she stood before the twin graves in Bethel Amish Cemetery. The bronze caskets gleamed in the filtered sunlight, finally giving David and Keisha the dignity they had been denied for so long. The congregation had gathered in numbers that would have made David smile folks from 3 counties who had followed the story and felt compelled to witness this moment of closure. Martha's hands no longer trembled as she held the worn Bible that David had given her on their wedding day, the same scripture she had read every October 15th for 17 years took on new meaning now. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Today, we don't just bury our beloved David and Keisha, Martha said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled mourners. We celebrate the truth that has finally set them free, and us with them. Evil tried to hide them away, to make their deaths meaningless, but God had other plans. Eunice stood beside her daughter, tears flowing freely, but her face radiant with something approaching triumph. Brother Thompson stepped forward to offer a prayer, his voice breaking as he thanked God for bringing the family home. Even some of the investigators who had worked the case were present, their faces showing the satisfaction that came from seeing justice done as Martha sprinkled earth on both caskets. She thought about Jake Morrison, who would serve 8 years in exchange for his testimony, a sentence that felt both merciful and just. Samuel Hayes and his surviving Brotherhood members would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Their perverted interpretation of faith finally exposed for what it truly was. The service concluded with the congregation singing Amazing Grace, their voices rising like a prayer toward the Alabama sky. As people began to disperse, offering final embraces and promises to keep the family in their prayers, Martha remained at the graveside with Eunice. "Are you ready to go home, baby girl?" Eunice asked gently. Martha looked once more at the headstones, bearing David and Keisha's names, their birth and death dates finally carved in permanent stone rather than held only in her memory. For the first time in 17 years, she felt truly ready to move forward. "Yes, Mama," she said, taking her mother's arm. "I think I finally am." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery as they walked away. But for Martha, the long night of searching was finally over.